And it's my pleasure now to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Arthi Prabhakar. She's the founder and CEO of the nonprofit Actuate and a former venture investor and former director of DARPA. She's also a Caltech Distinguished Alumnus. So we're so happy to have you here. Welcome back. We're looking forward to having you lay some knowledge on us. Go right ahead.
Thanks so much, Neil.
It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. And well, it's nice to be virtually at Caltech, if not physically. And I'll look forward to the next chance I have to be there in person. I'm really enjoying this conference. You're focused on, I think, the essential question that we all really care about, because we all know that despite the great progress that's being made with technologies and deployment and policy and finance, we have this vast decarbonization challenge in front of us. And we know we still need to find many, many new pathways to rapid scale deployment. And so thank you very much for putting a sharp eye on exactly that question. This topic of how we create new pathways, that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to just step back and say one word about Actuate, so you know where I'm coming from. As I was leaving DARPA a few years ago, the thing that I could not stop thinking about were the make or break challenges that we have ahead of us. Challenges like access to opportunity for every person. What does trust mean in this information age? Our health challenges, and most definitely on that list was climate change. These are the kinds of societal challenges that are pounding the table for new kinds of innovation, even beyond the phenomenal R&D that we're already doing. And that was the reason that we formed Actuate. We're a nonprofit, still a small organization. We exist to build experiments and innovation. And the climate effort that I'm going to talk about today is the work of my colleagues, Laura Pierpoint, who heads that effort, and Emily Lewis O'Brien and Sinquin Ni on her team. And I want to talk first about what I mean by climate scale. I want to share with you our hypothesis that systems innovation, a new form of innovation, is something that's vitally necessary if we're going to get to climate scale in time. And I'll give you an example of what that could look like. So let's go to the next slide. This is a chart I think everyone on this call is very familiar with. This is the global picture. We know that despite the very important progress that's happened, we're not yet on track to limit the worst consequences of climate change. The US piece of this global picture, of course, is our direct role in reducing our own emissions, and a very important indirect role as well in encouraging the rest of the world, first and foremost by being a good example. So I think we're all familiar with this extremely urgent problem that we have. And if you go to the next slide, you know, the focus of this meeting is about the scale of change in emissions that changes climate outcomes. And that's what I mean when I use the term climate scale. It's a scale of deployment that the climate actually notices. And here's an important calibration. So if you think about renewables, they've grown faster than pretty much anyone predicted over the last 15 years. It's been astonishing. It's been very gratifying to see. And when you aggregate what renewables are now able to do, they're abating about 5% of total emissions. 5% is the size of that little tiny blue bar. So this is a great success story because they are going to continue to grow. But I think it's also a very sobering reminder about what it takes and how long it takes to scale to the point that the climate notices. And I want to unpack that a little bit and go to the next slide, because when you have a problem of this scale and you don't know how you're going to solve it, to me, that's a clarion call for innovation. So let's start with how we think about innovation today. Typically, we think about it as this valley of death model. It's about a specific technology. It moves from stage to stage, and there is so much work to be done here. And the good news is we actually are doing more and better. If you think about ARPA-E, Activate, Breakthrough Energy, a host of other climate VCs, if you think about DOE demonstration programs and loan guarantees, we are in so much better of a place today on these valley of death problems than we were 10 or 15 years ago. I want to see all of those efforts succeed and grow because it's not yet enough, but we are really making progress. And that is the model for scaling from, meaning up from zero. But let's go to the next slide. Because really what we need is to scale to, and that's a very different question. It's about scaling to the point that the climate notices. And that actually takes a lot more. And here I've identified 5 domains that are interconnected, but they represent 5 very different domains that really make big change happen. And let me just try to bring that to life. If you go to the next slide with an example that I think we're all very familiar with. I chose solar PV. It's one of our great success stories today. This crowd for sure knows that the first commercial technology for solar electricity came out of Bell Labs in 1954. It started as a really tiny niche market to provide electrical power on our earliest satellites. And then over decades, as the environmental movement started, first our government backed R&D and subsidized buys. Eventually, in the 1990s, the Japanese tried rooftop subsidies, and then the Germans put in some feed-in tariffs. And then if you go to the next slide, we're sort of puttering along, but things got really lively much more recently. And when that happened, the finance community, the companies and industries that constitute the market, they started changing too. And of course, a major contributor in this period was Chinese manufacturing subsidies in the 2010s. And when the snowball started rolling, we started seeing investors adapting finance models from other industries, things like venture capital and project finance that weren't really originally for renewables. We saw new policy mechanisms like renewable portfolio standards, net metering. We saw something that's really at the intersection of finance and policy with investment tax credits and loan guarantees. And then, of course, in the marketplace, utilities and their regulators adapted and they changed their longstanding business models, and brand new business models emerged as new value chains formed and morphed. And at the top of this diagram, something very important was going on because, of course, individuals and communities were part of the end market because they bought solar electricity systems. But in a much more fundamental way, what drove the start of this kind of massive scale was people becoming more and more convinced that we couldn't just keep pumping carbon into the atmosphere. And the action that they took, in fact, in a fundamental sense, really underpins everything else that's on this chart. So what are we going to take away from this? Well, first of all, this process actually works. And secondly, I would point out that, in fact, innovation is happening in every one of these 5 domains, not just in technology. We've had investment approaches and finance approaches that worked and others that didn't. We had policies that worked and others that didn't. We tend not to talk about this as experimentation and innovation, but in fact, that's really what it is. And I think that, that's the good news, is it works, and it's a way to think about innovation I think is very different. If you go to the next slide, of course, this is the problem, is that now solar is starting to make this really important contribution. It's 7 decades since the Bell Labs first commercial product. And of course, we don't have those kinds of decades ahead of us for all the many other technologies that have to deploy at a truly massive scale. So if you go to the next slide, this was the question that got us thinking about the forms of innovation that could short circuit this very long process, that could break open much faster pathways to mass scale, to the scale that the climate notices. And this is our thesis. We call it systems innovation. And let me walk you through the 2 sides of it, because it starts on the left with thinking and acting in a systems context. And I think a great deal of work, in fact, I find, almost always policy work starts in the systems context and thinks about the whole system. We want to take it a step further and think about how you might mobilize actors across those 5 domains. And then beyond that, to find ways to demonstrate faster pathways that engage the parties across those 5 domains. And ultimately, how do we get the decision makers across those 5 domains to change their minds and start taking action that can move us much, much faster? So that's the left-hand side. The innovation part of this is equally important, because we're not talking about just getting a bunch of people together and having them move a little bit faster. We're talking about trying radically better approaches. We're talking about multiple approaches in parallel. We're talking about getting prototypes tested in real world settings of enough variety that they would tell you something about massive scale. And we're talking about generating the kind of practical evidence that changes people's minds much faster. So why isn't this already happening today? Really, I think that on the left-hand side, it really has to do with the fact that these many, many different actors are living in their own silos. They each have their own missions, their own incentive systems, whether it's a government agency or a business or a financial institution. And to do this kind of work does require breaking out of those silos. And on the right-hand side, we actually know how to mobilize capital to take a whole set of different kinds of risks, from basic research to venture capital and other forms of finance. But we don't actually have a category of capital that has learned how to take this kind of risk that's involved in systems innovation. And we think these are some of the reasons that it isn't happening yet today. And this is precisely what we are setting out at Actuate to prototype and show the world what it could look like and how it could dramatically accelerate decarbonization. So that's our theory. And if we go to the next slide, I'd like to give you an example of what we mean. It's just one example in one of the many sectors that you're seeing here on this slide that contribute to emissions. And the sector that this example's from is about electricity. And if you'll go to the next slide, our focus here in this example is systems innovation for deep demand flexibility. So if you go to the next slide after that, Sally showed us what needs to happen to fully decarbonize electricity in those marvelous charts that showed what the strategic plan is. This is a different chart. This is what the US Energy Information Administration says we're currently on track to do. And of course, it shows that we're on track right now to still have about half of our electricity generation coming from fossil fuels, even by 2050. So we've got a lot of change that has to get made. Renewables are growing here, but they're not growing fast enough to really meet the need in this projection of the future. And I think anyone who's working in this field understands that the issue here is that renewables are inexpensive relative to other options today. But grids, once they start having a lot of renewables on them, are not so inexpensive because the cost of dealing with the variability of renewables as you add storage and transmission starts driving costs up and driving complexity up. And that's why we see growth, but not sufficient growth in these projections. So if we go to the next slide, that's really why at Actuate we started digging into demand flexibility as an approach to knock down barriers to renewables deployment. And of course, the idea here is one that is often discussed, and that is to dynamically shift big loads in homes and other buildings, shifting those big loads to when renewable power is available. And if we had the ability to do this, as depicted in the bottom left diagram, which is the dream that people have in this area, if we had this ability to do this 24/7 across the whole customer base in a way that customers could accept and doesn't take a lot of their time and attention, some pretty big ifs, but if we had this capacity, think about what it could unlock in terms of greenhouse gas reductions on a much faster time scale. Very simply, building fewer gas peaker plants, which we're still building at a pretty good clip today. Secondly, making it easier to digest the shift to renewables. And then a third implication that I think is perhaps equally important, which is in addition to accelerating decarbonization of the electrical system, it would provide a lot of the resilience and capacity that's going to be important as we decarbonize other sectors, these harder to decarbonize sectors like buildings and vehicle transportation. Okay, so this is a pretty hard challenge, and despite the fact that this is a dream that a lot of people have, it's not on track to happen. Not much is happening. You sort of imagine it might happen over some number of decades, but those are the decades we don't have. So if you go to the next slide, when we start thinking about systems innovation for a hard challenge like this, the place we start is this question: what would it take? What would the future need to look like? Who would need to make what changes? Who would have to change their mind and then change what they do to make this future of 24/7 deep demand flexibility a reality. And we do this kind of systems look at the picture, first because it tells us why it isn't happening, and secondly because it tells us whose minds we'd have to change with the work that we aim to do in order to start moving the system there rapidly. And what we quickly found is we've been talking to dozens and dozens of different people and organizations in all of these different parts of this complex system: regulators, utilities, grid operators, all the people and all the organizations that live on the consumption side of the equation. And what very quickly becomes apparent is that this is a classic chicken and egg problem, because if regulators were to incorporate deep demand flexibility into their plans, they'd have to be convinced that the rest of the system is actually going to be able to deliver what is needed in some sort of practical way. But none of the rest of the system is willing to invest in large enough pilots that look like real demand flexibility to get to where they can convince themselves and regulators. So we're sort of stuck, and it's moving very, very slowly. So that's the situation today. If you go to the next slide, this is how we start thinking about, well, what might a systems innovation program look like in this field? And in this case, I think one of the really exciting prospects is that we have numbers of studies actually have been done about what full-scale deep demand flexibility would look like. And on these axes, we're on the vertical axis, we're talking about the number of customers. So think at the top here is full national scale deployment. On the horizontal axis is sort of an aggregation of many different elements of value. It's sort of the many, many, many reasons that would cause all the actors on the prior slide to move forward: system savings, reliability, and greenhouse gas reduction. For the future that we need, we're going to need to get to the where it says target, right, to the top and all the way to the right. And studies tell us that if we could get there, there's actually a tremendously interesting opportunity, because they project many tens of billions of dollars of annual system savings across the United States. They project the possibility of being able to shave a fifth or even a fourth of peaks, which would be enormous in terms of managing variability. And they lead to projections of very significant increases in the value of renewable energy. So this is where we would want to get. But if you go to the next slide, the problem we have today is there's no practical path from the things that we know how to do today to that upper right. So the things that we know how to do today are the existing demand response programs shown here on the left. And those actually have reached some reasonable scale. But again, as I think this group knows very well, really, first of all, they are there simply to provide a degree of grid stability. Their purpose is not, they're not really designed to provide greenhouse gas reductions. And the way they work is actually, to be sort of blunt, I think it's a little clunky, because utilities call for demand response very infrequently. I'm not sure their customers like it when they actually have to produce that demand response. It requires the customers on the other end to take an action. It really doesn't look like the kind of seamless demand flexibility that is required to get all the way over to the upper right. Now, we've also had some very interesting pilots on the bottom of this chart. They are really tiny, but they're super interesting. They sort of give you like a George Jetson view of what the future might look like if you had these very highly connected home of the future type environments. But they're tantalizing, but they're far from commercial feasibility. They don't have regulatory support because they don't really seem real enough. And of course, they aren't really tied to what in our work is the ultimate goal, which is greenhouse gas reduction. So we've got some things that are interesting, but they don't really give us a path to get to where we want to be. And that's really what we want to try to create. And if you go to the next slide, with the work that we are thinking about and planning at Actuate, which is a deep demand flexibility program. How we're thinking about it today is it's centered on a 5,000 customer demonstration takes essentially the way homes are today, but demonstrates the kind of a system with dynamic tariffs and the kind of automated control of these grid edge devices that works smoothly for customers in a way that doesn't interfere with how they live and function in their homes, and can be background to them and easy to accept, while really starting to show the practical feasibility of the kinds of impacts that are in this upper right. And 5,000 customers is still a very small scale, but we think that is the scale, approximately the scale of the real world demonstration that could start moving people over the hump to start taking demand flexibility much more seriously, much more quickly. So that's an example of what we think of in terms of systems innovation. If you go to the next slide, that's just one example in one sector. If you step back and look again at the whole picture of emissions, as we've been thinking through this lens of systems innovation, we see many, many, many possible opportunities where this kind of experimentation could break open faster pathways for decarbonization in this very short time period that we have. And I'll finish with the last slide simply to say, we think that systems innovation is one of the tools that can be ramped up and that could help us find faster pathways to add to all the excellent work that's already going on so that we ultimately can bend this curve fast enough. So I'll stop with that and welcome questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Arthi, for joining us and sharing the Actuate model. We've got time for questions, so there's a few questions that are already here, but please, those of you that are listening in, feel free to add your questions in and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. So you're sort of talking generally about innovating on innovation. And so that's a kind of an interesting meta discussion to have, I guess, at a lot of different levels. The first question that somebody posted in here is sort of, how do you think about emphasizing opportunity versus risk in order to motivate innovation? How does that differ when you're looking in the pure tech sector, working with the geeky engineers and scientists that I'm used to being surrounded by, and out into this sort of broader systems community? So maybe you can talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think that's a really fun question because I started my professional career at DARPA, where risk is something that you value and you talk about, and it's what you exist to do. And then I became director of NIST, which is responsible for the nation's measurement standards. And the first time I said risk, everyone just sort of, they went into shock because careful was their favorite word. And I think it really underscores the issue here because the reason we take risk in R&D and the reason we would take risk in these systems innovation programs is precisely because we're trying to reach for something that you can't get to without taking risk. But it also is the reason that the rest of the world doesn't do it. It's why companies don't do it. It's why a utility won't do it or a regulator won't try it, because they are not in the business of taking risk. They are in the business of making sure that electricity gets delivered where it's needed. And so I very much think about these programs that we're talking about in this context as deliberately and very carefully and thoughtfully taking risk in order to kill it off so that the people who aren't in the risk-taking business can change their minds and start moving forward.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I was, I'm a metrology geek, so I was very excited about things like the retirement of the kilogram standard a couple of years ago, and trying to explain to my friends how exciting that is from a physics perspective. But really, it is all about not ready to do that until you're really sure you don't have any risk left in making those statements. I can imagine the NIST folks taking a very different view than the people at DARPA did.
And you need both. You need both views, exactly.
Absolutely. So just focusing in on some of your deep demand flexibility example. Somebody asked, complex systems are typically much less resilient. So sort of how do you fold in resilience, especially as we're starting to think more and more about the needs on the electricity system to be resilient, not only to malware attacks or other sort of traditional or cyber bad actors, but also just the changing climate and the sort of increased dangers that we've seen from fires and floods and weather.
Yeah, no, resilience in every dimension is key. And as we're already on this trajectory to have more computer controlled systems, more software driven systems in electricity. And so absolutely the cyber questions are critical. Laura Pierpoint, who runs our climate activities at Actuate, one of her many experiences before was actually digging into that issue for the Department of Energy. And so it's very much on our minds that that has to be integral to the way these the prototype systems that we would develop would have to deal with those issues up front.
Oh, great. Okay. So, when you start thinking about innovating across these multiple different pillars all at the same time, I guess the question would be sort of how much social innovation is needed, right? Where there's a lot of those of us that are familiar with innovating in the tech sector, we think about doing our experiments and iterating our technology products, but how you deal with the sort of societal change, acceptance of different technologies, acceptance of the sort of changing mentality. One of the reasons why these things happen in a serial process is because that typically takes time, and you need to build up that confidence. So how do you try and put those things together at the same time?
Yeah, and this gets to the heart of this systems framing on innovation, because I think, if you're just pushing the technology noodle, all of those things just become obstacles. But if you flip your lens and you start thinking about how what you're really trying to do is to get these 5 very different domains to all want the same thing, so that finance, the market, policies, the technology is capable, and communities and individuals are ready to embrace it. And just to use the deep demand flexibility example, if we can't solve the problem and consumers have to interact with complex systems to install a demand flexibility capability, and then they have to do something every day to provide this load flexibility to the utilities, it's hard to see how that's really going to scale, because people have other things to do, right? So the really understanding what it's going to take for every part of that system, including individuals and communities, to say, yes, we want to do this. It might lead to rate reductions. That would be awesome. That would open up a level of community support that could be very, very significant. But at a minimum, that's, in this case, for that technology, it has to be something that isn't an annoyance if we're going to get adoption. And all of those have to be considered from the beginning if we're going to make this kind of progress.
Yeah, it's a hard challenge. And there's 2 questions that take this in 2 different directions. So I'm going to try and remember where they went as I go from one to the other. So the first one is, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the multiple valleys of death, the sort of traditional investment approach towards these technologies. And one of the things that struck me as you were talking and as we've been going through the Q&A is the different valleys of death are actually, to some extent, each designed to solve one of those 5 individual pieces sort of one at a time. So we knock out this piece, and then there's the next challenge. And so we knock out that piece, and then we need to sort of make it past the third one. And so, that's a rationale that has worked, albeit way too slowly, as you showed in your solar example. So how do you convince the people that maybe would have been one of the later stages of those, the later valleys of innovation hurdles, without having done all the technological prove outs or other things there? Yeah.
I mean, those valleys of death start with research and they end with massive deployment. And the basic research almost always has to start with public dollars or philanthropic dollars, because that is not, that's why we have public and philanthropic funding of R&D, is at the early stage of R&D that doesn't produce returns, guaranteed returns for the person that's spending the money. And so one thing that you have to have in the back of your head is that a transition has to happen between public dollars that start, and then private dollars that provide the massive capital, the trillions of dollars of capital that ultimately will be required for this huge climate transition that we're in. And in my mind, it's actually pretty clear what happens on both ends, because on the basic research end, we have ways of funding research and experimenting in the laboratory, in universities, in our national labs. And to some extent, companies do some of that very early stage research that matters for climate. And then all the way on the other end of the picture, that's when a technology is so mature that someone can, be guaranteed to generate a market rate of return with essentially no risk whatsoever. And of course, in the middle, it is very messy. And somehow you have to get from this publicly funded part. Traditionally, we have not had public funding that went far enough for the private part that needs to make returns to be able to catch it. So I think we're doing a little bit better in closing that valley of death. But then even on the private market side, if you think about it, every single stage of investor, the early stage venture investor, the later stage venture investor, private equity, project finance, the big deployment capital, every single piece of it has to have a way to make money, a risk-adjusted rate of return that works. And talk about an experiment. We venture capital tried, a decade or 15 years ago, and then retreated. And now we're having a second really important surge in climate tech venture capital. That's what I mean by experimentation. These are people who are out there taking these risks and trying new theses about what could both deal with climate, but also generate returns for them. And I don't think we're done, because I think we will need to continue to innovate and experiment. And money will be made and money will be lost, but eventually this whole system moves when you start seeing repeatable patterns and more capital can keep coming in.
Yeah. So the other point that I was thinking about when we were talking about the social innovation piece is much more sort of squarely in the social innovation, which is energy in general. The energy sector is regulated, and so we have a Public Utilities Commission or other people there, and they're worried about things like, how is this going to affect cost? And now we're starting to layer in, how is this going to affect GHG reductions? When you start to look at some of the really innovative and interesting technologies out there, and fusion has come up a bunch, and we're going to hear from a person from the Fusion Industry Association as our final speaker today. There's an entirely different set of social questions around sort of how you accept the sort of small probability but very high risk events like things that are traditionally related with sort of our former experiences with nuclear power. So we need to do all of these things at the same time, but the kinds of social innovation that we need to be doing along with the tech innovation, it's different for deep demand flexibility than it is for fusion power. And so sort of are there ways that we can learn from those things and do them together, or do they each have to really be taken as individual pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some learning from one area or sector to the other, but you're really right. I mean, if you're going to solve these problems, you have to really understand what the underlying issues are in all domains for that particular area. And they're just, it's very, like, someone being annoyed about having to deal with their demand response system is a pretty different issue than concerns about nuclear threats. So yes, that absolutely has to be tailored to the specific circumstance.
Yeah. And there's one of the challenges, I think, with these sort of system approaches is that every system has got a lot of different actors, and you need to really understand what's bringing them in. Yeah. So I'm going to push you a little bit outside of the tech area. We have a question here that says, to what extent can this sort of systems innovation approach be part of a pre-K to 16 climate action or educational curricula? Have you been thinking about sort of not just how to show that this works, but how to start to infuse that into the educational programs? Yeah,
I mean, what I really want to see is that this approach starts becoming validated and then visible and then starts scaling, because all the participants in that ecosystem, all those different domains, start saying, well, we're just going to have to do this. We're going to have to find ways to do it. And that, government, private sector, everybody who's in the mix. The education piece, though, I think is really interesting because, and I think this ties to a broader trend that I've seen certainly in engineering education, which is I think we've recognized as we train these next generations of engineers that yes, that deep domain knowledge is so incredibly valuable. But if we're going to train engineers who can go out in the world and solve some of these really thorny problems, they also need to understand the context for their work and value and be able to work with not just other engineering domains, but I would argue some of these kinds of very practical domains of policy and finance and markets and communities and how individuals approach these technologies. So I do see it as a broader, this idea of understanding how complex our world's problems are, but that there are paths through that and you can be part of that. I actually think that's one of the most exciting things that we can share with all of our kids, including engineers.
Yeah. One of the points that came up in conversation yesterday was we were talking about the food system, and a quote from somebody who had been involved in a lot of innovations in genetic engineering to increase productivity of crops, dealing with activists who are trying to fight on sort of anti-GMO terms, is like, if you've ever spent time in a place where there's real food insecurity, you would be trying to do everything that you can to make a difference. And I think that part of that carries forward into the discussion you're having here, right? In every one of these areas, there are communities that are impacted, and you want the engineers and the policymakers and the activists and everybody to be fully aware of the issues that are actually affecting the community there.
Yeah, and I would just tag on to that to say, if you open your lens from innovation from when I was at Caltech, I was studying deep level defects in semiconductor material systems. That's innovation. But if you broaden your horizons and you think about innovation as the ability to experiment and learn and iterate and get better in all these different areas, one of the sources of innovation is going to be individuals and communities, because these are the places where the rubber meets the road. This is where people live the experience of the problems that we're talking about. And I think it's very constructive to shift our lens, not just as those are the recipients of innovation, but they are integrally important as sources of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we got another question here. Can you elaborate on the policy aspects of increasing the value of emissions reduction, such as a carbon tax? Taking deep demand flexibility as an example, flexibility is way undervalued by current DR programs or grid services. So how do you incentivize making those things valuable enough to really get that going?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question gets at the heart of, why do our complex systems, including any of these complex infrastructures that contribute to emissions, why do they work the way they do? They are absolutely creatures of the incentives that we as a society have built and told them they're doing the behaviors that we've instructed them to do based on the incentives that we've set. And so absolutely, the major change in all these infrastructures, the way it happens is to change those incentives. It's for all the obvious reasons, that's a very hard process. And as urgent as the need is, the inertia and the fear and the concern when incentives change, those are many of the things that do slow things down. So yeah, I mean, people like to talk about a carbon tax. I like to ask the question: if you had a carbon tax, how long would it take for the systems to start changing? And irrespective of whether we get a carbon tax or not, figuring out how you knock down those barriers so that people and institutions can change more rapidly, that's the work that has to get done. And if you show people how it can be done, if you engage them in that process and make them authors of the change, we think that's one of the ways that we can achieve faster change with these hard problems.
Just continuing to push on that a little bit. The question is, you're approaching this with Actuate from a private sector perspective. I mean, obviously you're nonprofit, but you're trying to figure out where you can push this forward. Is it? Do you see ways in which these systems innovation ideas are applicable? You have, been at NIST, you've been at DARPA, so you thought about sort of how to push these from a federal side. So, do you see how it fits over the lens of how we do this thing from a federal policy perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the starting point is to say that the examples that we are working on systems innovation are the R&D that we're proposing that needs to be done requires the kind of capital that's not designed to generate a market return. So we're starting with philanthropic dollars, but what we want to show is how this works. And if we can prove that and start getting some real examples out in the world, then there are multiple classes of capital that's not designed to generate a financial return, philanthropy, but obviously government. And we think that we'd like to see it expand in those ways. And I think when you do this work, you also you can spark ideas even in the for-profit sector and in the finance community where they exist to make a profit. But as they start seeing these acceleration capacities, my hope is that they will engage and get closer to this kind of model of systems innovation. Again, to add to all the important, because everything we're doing, we need to do. I'm just proposing that we need to add a new form of innovation on top of that.
All right, maybe we got time for one more question here. So how do you incorporate not just making things easy for consumers to change, but factor in resistance from potential losers, when you're doing this sort of systems work that are real? We were talking to Pedro Pizarro earlier about some of the challenges around net metering policy changes in California. There are winners and there are losers and all of these discussions. So how do you factor that sort of work into doing this innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think for number one, try to at the beginning of thinking about a big change, use your imagination, and I think it's very easy for all of us as technology proponents to see the benefits and the excitement of what's possible, but you really have to also push yourself. I always like to ask my program managers at DARPA, what could possibly go wrong? Because you really have to be very clear about that up front as well. And when you're clear about that, there are a couple of things. Sometimes you can shape your R&D in a direction that actually leads to better outcomes for a broader class of people. Not always, but sometimes, and that's really helpful. Sometimes it's going to be a matter of finding ways to compensate for the problems that the people who are on the losing end have. But irrespective, I think the role of all of us as innovators is to shine a light on that and be responsible. And not just be, pure promoters of the things that we're excited about.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, that was fast enough. We can try one more thing here. So does the impending recession present an opportunity or an obstacle to accelerate the energy transition? And what are ways to tap into that?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm sure the answer is both. And I think it's gonna, well, first of all, we don't know what's going on with markets and what's gonna happen. I mean, whatever Yogi Berra said about predicting the future certainly applies here. But we are in interesting financial times, and I think it's going to have some interesting consequences. So I don't have a crystal ball on that, but I think it's a great question.
All right. Well, with that, we'll just say thank you, Arthi. That was wonderful. Thank you for spending so much time showing us what you've been putting together at Actuate and talking about the potential. And I think it's a great opportunity to try and innovate and maybe speed up the whole innovation cycle a little bit more. So thanks
for the chance to be with you. Thanks so much, Neil.
Thank you.